Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're going to get practical today. We're going to be looking at historian Timothy Snider's On Tyranny. You've been going through his 20 lessons for fighting tyranny, and we're going to focus on the last three, which are all about taking action. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives. Be a patriot, and be as courageous as you can. They might sound a little intense, but they're surprisingly relevant to our everyday lives.
You know, what's so fascinating about Snyder is he doesn't just talk about historical tyranny. He makes it very clear these lessons apply here and now. It's like he's saying, don't think it can't happen because it can.
Yeah, like that feeling so many of us had on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol. It was unthinkable to many, but it happened. And Snyder uses that as a jumping-off point, doesn't he? To say we need to accept that unthinkable events can occur.
He does. And it's not about living in fear, it's about being prepared. Snyder argues that authoritarians thrive on exploiting chaos. He brings up how the Nazis used the Reichstag fire, the burning of the German parliament building, to justify grabbing more power. And even more recently, Putin. Putin used apartment bombings in Russia to create a climate of fear, which allowed him to push through really extreme policies.
So is Snyder saying that if we are prepared for the unthinkable, then we're less likely to panic and make bad choices? That could actually help authoritarians.
Exactly. He actually encourages us to think about potential threats to democracy right now, even if they seem far-fetched. To be prepared to act, not just react. It's like building a muscle. But for democracy, think about something like voter suppression efforts. They might seem like isolated incidents, but Snyder argues they can be the first cracks in the foundation.
That makes sense. Yeah. So it's not just about staying calm when things are happening, but also having that long-term awareness of how things can unravel. So how does being a patriot, Snyder's next lesson, fit into all of this?
Well, this is where Snyder gets really interesting. He draws a very sharp distinction between patriotism and nationalism. He says blind nationalism is about defending the status quo, no matter what, even if it's harmful. True patriotism, on the other hand, is about holding our country accountable to its ideals.
So it's not just about waving a flag, it's about actively working to make the country better.
Absolutely. And for Snyder, in the U.S. context, protecting voting rights for all citizens is a key patriotic act, especially with all these efforts to limit voting access for certain groups. He's basically saying that if you care about America's ideals, you have to fight for everyone's right to participate in democracy.
He's really calling out that complacency, isn't he? That it's not enough to just assume that American democracy is invincible. It takes work. We have to be the patriots, the ones safeguarding those ideals.
Yeah, it's like he's saying the system relies on us to actively defend it. He uses examples from history, people who risked everything to stand up for democratic values when things got tough. It's a powerful reminder that our actions matter, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Okay, we've talked about staying calm and being engaged citizens. But then there's that last lesson. Be as courageous as you can. That one feels a bit daunting. Like, am I supposed to suddenly become some kind of superhero?
Well, that's what I love about this lesson. Snyder makes courage accessible. He says it doesn't always have to be these huge, dramatic acts. It can be as simple as speaking up against injustice in a casual conversation or making eye contact with someone who's being excluded.
It's funny you say that because those things do take courage sometimes, even if we don't think of them that way. Like when you see someone being treated unfairly and you know you should say something, but you hesitate.
Exactly. Snyder points to Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. That single act, defying a harmful norm, sparked a movement. He's saying these seemingly small acts of courage can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same.
So we're not waiting for permission to be courageous or for some epic moment to arrive. It's about those daily choices, right? Those opportunities to stand up for what's right, no matter how small they seem.
That's the key. And when enough people start making those choices, it creates this culture of resistance that makes it much harder for tyranny to take hold. It's almost like we're building an immunity to it.
So being courageous isn't about being fearless. It's about acting even when we are afraid. And those small acts add up, creating a stronger defense against those who would exploit fear and division.
Exactly. Snyder argues that fostering a culture of courage is essential for safeguarding democracy.
So how do we actually do this? How do we make courage more commonplace, not just something we read about in history books?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, Snyder offers some really practical advice. He starts by telling us to be kind to our language. Words matter, especially when authoritarians are trying to twist them to their advantage.
Can you give an example? I'm not sure I understand what he means.
Sure. Let's take the word extremist.
Yeah.
It's a powerful word. and it can be used to shut down debate, to label anyone who disagrees as dangerous or radical. Snider says we need to be careful about how we use terms like that.
So it's about being precise with our language, not letting those loaded words be used to manipulate us.
Right, and it's not just about the words we use, it's about the words we hear. Snider tells us to listen for dangerous words. Pay attention to how language is being used to create fear, division, or a sense of urgency.
You know, it's funny because we see this all the time in the news and on social media. Like suddenly everyone's an enemy or a traitor if they don't agree with a certain viewpoint.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Snider's warning against. He wants us to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives we're being fed, and not just accept things at face value.
It's like that old saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Deb. But in this case, it's more like, don't believe everything you hear from people in power, especially when they're using fear tactics.
I think that's a great way to put it. And this ties into Snider's advice to believe in truth. He's not talking about some abstract philosophical concept here. He's talking about the importance of facts, evidence, and a shared understanding of reality.
So how do we find that truth when there's so much misinformation out there?
Snider suggests supporting investigative journalism, he says. Subscribe to a newspaper, or better yet, subscribe to a local newspaper and to a national newspaper. It doesn't matter if you never completely agree with either one of them. The point is to create the mental habit of considering the world from more than one perspective.
I think that's a really important point, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides. It's so easy to get stuck in our own little echo chambers, where we only hear what we want to hear.
He also encourages us to notice the signs of authoritarianism. This is where knowing history becomes really important.
You mean being able to recognize those patterns we talked about earlier, like the Nazis using the Reichstag fire to justify their power grab, or Putin exploiting the apartment bombings in Russia?
Exactly. If we can spot those early warning signs, we're in a better position to resist them. And it's not just about big, dramatic events. Snider says to pay attention to things like attempts to control the media, suppress dissent, or demonize certain groups.
So we're talking about being vigilant, not just in moments of crisis, but in our everyday lives, looking for those subtle shifts that could signal a move toward authoritarianism. But what can we do when we see those signs?
Well, that's where courage comes in. Snider reminds us that standing out can be an act of defiance. He uses Rosa Parks as an example again. She didn't set out to be a hero. She just refused to conform to an unjust law. And that simple act sparked a movement.
It's almost like those small acts of courage, when multiplied by enough people, can create a force field against tyranny. But it's not always easy to be that person who stands out, is it?
No, it's not. And that's why Snider emphasizes the importance of community. He says, make eye contact and small talk. This is not just polite. It is a way to stay in touch with your surroundings, break down social barriers, and understand whom you should and should not trust. You never know when a seemingly casual interaction could turn into a moment of solidarity or even resistance.
It's like that Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
And that's why it's so important to find the others, as Snider puts it. Connect with people who share your values, who are also committed to defending democracy. This could be through joining organizations, attending protests, or simply having conversations with friends and family about these issues.
So we're talking about building a network of support, a community of people who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
Exactly. Because when you have that network, it's easier to find the courage to act. You know you're not alone. And that collective action can make a real difference.
This makes me think about all the different ways people can contribute. It doesn't always have to be about grand gestures or being on the front lines.
You're right. Snider talks about contributing to good causes, and he means it in the broadest sense. It could be donating to an organization that's working to protect voting rights, volunteering your time at a local community center, or simply speaking up against injustice in your daily life.
It's about finding those ways to make a positive impact, no matter how small they seem. And when enough people do that, it creates a ripple effect that can lead to real change. But it all starts with that individual decision to act, right? To choose courage over complacency.
Absolutely. Snider reminds us that the future is plural, meaning that it's shaped by the choices we make, both individually and collectively. So the question is, what kind of future do we want to create?
It feels like we've been given this toolkit, but the responsibility lies with us to use it. Snider doesn't sugarcoat it, does he? He makes it clear that defending democracy is an ongoing process, not a one-time event.
He doesn't, and he emphasizes that it's not just about defending our own country, it's about supporting democracy globally. He even suggests something as simple as making friends abroad.
I love that. It sounds so simple, but it's true. Those personal connections can help us understand different perspectives and build solidarity across borders.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that the fight for democracy is interconnected. What happens in one country can impact the rest of the world. Snider actually encourages us to be reflective if you must be armed.
Wait, what does he mean by that?
It's a nuanced point. He acknowledges that there are times when armed resistance might be necessary, but he urges us to be cautious and thoughtful about it. He says, the moment you pick up a gun, you become a subject of history, not its author. It's a powerful reminder that violence can have unintended consequences, and it should always be a last resort.
That's a sobering thought. So much of Snider's advice is about being proactive, about taking action before things reach a crisis point.
Exactly. And that's why he stresses the importance of taking responsibility for the face of the world, as he puts it. It's about not looking away from injustice, not being complacent, but actively working to make things better.
You know, this is really making me think about my own role in all of this. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges we're facing.
I know. It is overwhelming. But Snider's message is ultimately one of empowerment. He reminds us that we all have a role to play, no matter how small it might seem.
So if someone's listening to this right now, and they're feeling inspired, but also a bit lost, where do they even begin?
I think Snider would say, start with those small acts of courage. Speak up when you see injustice. Support organizations that are fighting for democratic values. Connect with people who share your concern.
And don't underestimate the power of those everyday choices. Snider's point is that those choices, when multiplied by millions of people, can create a force that tyranny can't withstand.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where courage is the norm, not the exception, where people are expected to stand up for what's right, not just for themselves, but for others as well.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that the fate of democracy rests not with some distant power, but with the choices that each of us makes every single day.
So as you go about your day, ask yourself, what can I do in my own unique way to contribute to that culture of courage? How can I help make those acts of resistance, those expressions of freedom, more and more commonplace?
Because that's how we build a world where tyranny doesn't stand a chance. That's the legacy we leave for future generations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you leave feeling empowered and ready to take action.